We're continuing with part 2 of chapter 7, and we left off talking about tray assembly. And this is a great diagram of a pretty typical tray line configuration or tray assembly line. You can see that on the upper half of the picture there's what's represented to be steam tables, so the hot food is generally all on one side of the tray line, and you can see that it's adjacent to a hot food cooking area. In the middle is the tray assembly line with normally a motorized belt that will carry the trays from one end of the line to another. There are tray lines that just use a roller style of system, and each worker just pushes the tray down. That works great in small hospitals, not so great in larger hospitals. And then all the cold stations, refrigerated storage, air curtains, or just carts holding cold food are on the lower half of the picture with backups in the reach-in refrigerator adjacent to it. This is a fairly long tray line. It has, how many people? 9 people. 9 people. I'd say this would be for a larger hospital. Still not a really, like I said, the kitchen at Sierra Vista was really designed for a 175-bed hospital. In the early 1980s, a typical census was somewhere around 120. A busy census was 140, so that's why the kitchen seems large for the number of patients that they're serving now. But it functioned quite effectively with a tray line that was, let me think, there were 2 people on the hot side and 1 person on the cold side, a starter, and then a checker at the end. So it was considerably shorter than this example. Again, depending on how many trays you need to assemble in the period of time that's suitable for the meal service for your operation. In big facilities, if they use a tray line system, they may need to have multiple tray assembly line areas. So it would not be uncommon in a very large, in a 500 or 800 bed hospital, to see 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4 tray assembly line areas. The same would be true with pod stations or other tray assembly areas in order to have enough time to assemble that many trays served to a large number of patients. These are some good examples of some of the equipment that you need to be surrounded by when you're assembling trays. Again, in healthcare, it's always about heat maintenance, but it's particularly critical in healthcare because there's usually a distance from where the food is prepared and assembled to the patient's bedside. And in some cases, it can be a very long distance. And so it's almost universal that you will see some kind of a heat maintenance system. At Sierra Vista, they use Aladdin Heat on Demand. That's a system that we purchased in the late 1990s, and it looks exactly the same. It could be that that's a new heat activator base. They may have had to replace it in all those years. I would be greatly impressed if it was still functioning after about 15 years, I guess that would be, or 16 years. At the time, we bought the heat activator, we bought the pellet bases, we bought the dome covers, and new carts and new china. And altogether, I think it was about a $40,000 purchase, and that was in the late 1990s. So in today's dollars, I'm not sure it would be probably significantly more than that. But you not only need that to keep the pellets hot, but then you also need plate warmers to warm your dinner plates. You need racks to hold the trays so they can air dry. You need racks for the dome covers, and you may need other pieces of equipment for other parts of the tray assembly process. Here's a diagram of a pod station, and this is very similar to what we saw at Sierra Vista. Again, they converted their tray line space to 2 pod stations so that each catering associate has access across from them to someone who can serve the hot food onto the plate that the patient has requested. They have an air curtain refrigerator to the side that has all of the cold food items that have been prepared for lunch. So they're in the refrigerator until the moment when they're put on the tray. And then they also have the availability of the condiments, the silverware, the trays, and any other things that they might need, cold milk and that type of thing. So that's, again, this is a newer tray assembly system. It's become more popular in the last 7 or 8 years. It's more, how do I want to say it? There's more accountability here because, again, one person generally is involved with all of the assembly of the tray, as well as the delivery of the cart to the care area, as well as delivery of the tray to the patient, so that if the patient needs a tea bag or needs a salt packet, it's very easy for that person to respond because they have some ownership in that meal and in the satisfaction that that patient has related to that meal. When you distribute meals, you may have all of these different elements in play. You may have no method of thermal support whatsoever. And I recall last year we took a field trip to Bella Vista, one of the long-term care facilities here in town, and they don't use a heated thermal support system. They simply use a hot plate. They assemble the food as quickly as they can and try to deliver it to their patients as quickly as they can. So I'm not sure how effectively they do that, but that's a challenge. It means you have to get the food out very quickly, much like you would in banquet-style service. You can use methods that keep the hot food hot. You can do both heated thermal retention as well as cold thermal retention, or you can only keep the food cold and then have a way of heating the food when it reaches its destination. So there's a variety of different configurations that you'll encounter through. These are more of the tools that you might see that are specifically related to hot thermal retention. Again, the heated base that goes under the dinner plate is critically important for keeping the hot food hot. And we heard when we were at Sierra Vista that that hot pellet base can keep the food at temperature for 30 minutes if all the parts are working together correctly. In the picture, you see the Dynex version of the heat activator. At Sierra Vista, we saw the Aladdin version. Those are two different companies that make tray line types of equipment, Dynex and Aladdin. You also see I'm not sure if that's a plate warmer or if that's a pellet base warmer that's on the lower right. But the picture in the very center that has the dome cover, the plate, and then the base beneath it, I particularly wanted you to see that because that's actually a pellet. You've heard us or heard me talk about pellet bases, but in truth, there's not a hospital in our geographic area that has used pellets for a long number of years. When I first got into the profession and in my first jobs in the late 1970s and early 1980s, pellets were the norm. And the pellet was that little round disc that you see in the bottom of that base unit. They were heated in a pellet oven. They would be dropped into the pellet base. You'd set the plate on top of it and then the dome cover on top of that. And they were the best that we had at that time. But definitely from a sustainability perspective, it was much better when that pellet became what was called a unitized base, and the example of that is what we see in the very small picture to the left. And I'm sorry I can't make it bigger, but it'll get fuzzy. I can't get a good resolution on it. And that was when they took that core material that's in the pellet and made it a part of the base, so that now we only had one piece of equipment to wash instead of two. And it appeared, well, I didn't get a chance to ask about it, but I think at Cottage they're actually still using a unitized base. I did not see an induction system there, and I was really surprised about that because everything else they had was so advanced and so current that I was surprised to see just a conventional unitized base, but apparently it's working for them so far. And then the induction is what we saw at Sierra Vista. They all come with insulated components, dome covers, cereal bowls, coffee mugs, and so on that help to keep those other things that can't go under the dome cover as hot as they possibly can be. And then you may or may not have a cart that actually helps to keep hot food hot. And I've got some examples of those coming up. So these are some, there's a good image on the lower left of a typical tray with insulated components, a hot base with a plate on it with containing the hot food, a dome cover, a coffee cup with a lid on it, nicely wrapped silverware, and all of those things together would hopefully work effectively to keep the hot food hot and the cold food cold. What you see on that tray is the salad is not receiving any kind of cold thermal support, nor is the fruit salad or the fruit cup. But again, those are things that are generally satisfactory to consume as long as they're just cool. They don't have to be ice cold. And so that would be an acceptable way of serving those foods, and that's quite common. You also see in the center picture a tray system that is, I actually haven't seen this system in use also for quite a while, but the equipment is still sold, and so I feel like I need to introduce it to you. It uses they're insulated trays, but they're made to actually stack one upon the other so that they form a column, so that all the hot food is above itself, all the cold food is above other cold food, and all those things working together help to keep the hot food hot and the cold food cold. This was primarily, again, an institutional kind of a setting, even more like something that you might see in perhaps a psych hospital, perhaps a correctional facility or something of that nature. There may be hospitals that used it, but it's not something I saw in my own experience. The rack on the right is specifically designed to hold dome covers and pellet bases so that they have a place to air dry and they're readily available. Those racks also lift off of that cart and can go right into the dishwasher. These are a couple of examples of what's called a split tray system. This came from a hospital in Oxnard that one of my Pepperdine students did as a part of their project. And what you'll notice is that the trays actually slide into that cart. The cart is actually plugged into a unit in the wall, and it is literally split so that half of the tray has hot food on it, and that half of the cart is heated. The other half of the tray has cold food on it, and that half of the cart is refrigerated. This is a relatively new system. When the student went, I believe this was St. John's in Oxnard, they were very happy with the system. They did say that it was exceedingly expensive, but they had been planning for it, and they felt that it was worth it for them, but it was an exceptionally expensive kind of system. So I'm showing you this picture of UCSF. This was the hospital where I was lucky enough to do my internship, and it's a pretty good example of not an unusual configuration of a hospital. The building in the center that's sort of cross-shaped, not the one that looks like a cube. The cube one is the outpatient building, I think, but directly across the street from that is Moffitt Hospital, and it's a 15 or 14-story building. That was the main part of the hospital. The kitchen was on the second floor, and everything went upstairs to the patient care areas by elevator. But the building all the way to the right, 4 buildings down to the right, was what we called at that time was the old University of California Hospital. It was the original building that had been built probably 80 or 100 years before that and had served as the hospital until the newer buildings to the left were built. The buildings in the middle were not hospital. The buildings in the middle were like the medical school and the dental school, but to get from Moffitt Hospital to Old UC Hospital, trays had to be pushed in carts a really, really, really long distance. In fact, the carts, it was so far that they actually had motorized carts that had little motors that actually helped them to get there because it was so far to push. And that was a great example of a system that really needed thermal support. They had sub-kitchens down in the old UC hospital, but they were not equipped with rethermalization equipment. Again, this is the 1970s. Some of that technology just was not effectively available, and so what they had were motorized carts and a heat maintenance system, and they did the best they could to get the food down to those patients. Since then, that old building has been demolished. I think the new dental school is there, and now there are only patients in Moffitt Hospital. There are other branches of UC Hospital, but they, as far as I know, they each have their own food production areas. But you're going to see a picture at the end of Presbyterian Hospital of Plano, and it's not unusual as hospitals have to expand. They can't always add new kitchens, and oftentimes they expand horizontally, and so it increases the distance that trays have to travel, and so having a way to keep things hot and get there effectively is just a common challenge. These are additional examples of carts. The one on the lower left is quite typical of the carts you saw at Sierra Vista. They have neither heated nor cold features to the cart, but the tray has the heated pellet base to keep at least the hot food hot. The upper right is the one similar to what we saw at the hospital in the image that I told you about, the hospital in Oxnard. And the one on the lower right is not so much a tray cart, but it's a service cart that would have things like tea and coffee, has a toaster on it, and so it could, again, be placed in an area to provide things that are nice when they're served hot and then served immediately to the patient. The lower left would be what would be called an enclosed transport cart. And neither of these are exclusively refrigerated, but there are some carts that are all refrigerated, and then the hot food is reconstituted in either a microwave or a convection oven a little closer to the site where it's going to be served. These are some good examples of insulated equipment that you might see to help transport hot food. We saw something similar to this with senior nutrition, and we're going to see some again when we go to Camp San Luis Obispo. They have equipment that's necessary for when the soldiers are out in the field or when they need to send food to a remote location. They use quite a bit of insulated equipment where they can't plug it in, but they need to find a way to keep the hot food hot. And so these are some good examples of insulated equipment. What you'll notice on the lower left picture is there are inserts that can go into those pieces of equipment that can either be frozen for cold food or can be heated up for hot food, so that they help to keep the hot food hot and the cold food cold. These are a couple more good examples of carts that specifically rely on cold retention. The cart on the right uses a system where it actually has a warmer under each plate and then a chiller under each of the cold foods. Again, really complicated. I've never worked in a system like this one, but it is out there and it is available, and you might run across it. And then the cart on the lower left is another version of a split cart. Sometimes the trays actually come in two parts, and then you would set the cold food in, sort of nest it on top of the tray where the hot food is, so that it would all come together as one tray. When you have no way of or no need for keeping hot food hot, you normally would want to cover the plate, as you might see in banquet service, or many times in restaurants the plate is just brought directly from the kitchen where the food is prepared directly to your table, and again, there's no need to cover it or to provide any thermal support, because hopefully it takes a minute or so to actually get that tray to you. You do see sometimes in long-term care facilities trays that are simply covered and then delivered as quickly as possible to the patient without using any kind of thermal support. This slide shows you the different categories of service, and I think you've probably seen good examples of each of these in almost every place we've been. Even Senior Nutrition does delivery, and so we haven't seen any counter service, but probably all of you have seen that in places around town where food is served at the counter. This is just a summary of table service. We've all experienced it. You're seated at a table. A server will take your order and then bring the food back to you once it's prepared. Normally there is a host or a hostess. In a fine dining restaurant, there might be a maitre d' that would be responsible for seating you and providing you with information about the quality of service. I'll pause here and I'll finish up with the last section soon.